Okay, welcome to 17.2. What types of biological hazards do we face? Um, so we're going to dig right into these different types of biological hazards. So an infectious disease is anything that is a pathogen and it invades the body and it multiplies once it's in the body there. Broadly speaking, a transmissible disease is anything that's contagious or communicable at all. And infectious diseases are transmitted between people. And there are some examples here of that. So spreading from one person to the next, that would make it transmissible. Non-transmissible diseases are those things that are not caused by living organisms. So due to maybe lifestyle choices, things like most cancers, heart disease, diabetes, and while there is a genetic component to those, most of those, a lot of that has to do with your lifestyle choices. With improvements in healthcare in a country or in the world, we've seen the deaths from infectious diseases drop quite a bit over the last 70 years or so. There's still a major threat, though. I mean, even if we have better health, still a threat. They can spread in all sorts of ways. Air, water, you can see the other things there too. And they can give rise to, like what we're seeing right now. I'm recording this in March of 2020. So we see things like the coronavirus epidemic. It's spread through, as far as we can tell, probably the air. But, possibly other methods of transmission as well. As we treat certain pathogens with antibiotics, some can develop antibiotic resistance, and so it can be more difficult to kill them, get rid of them, treat them with antibiotics or with pesticides if it's like a plant that's infected. Because they multiply rapidly, they tend to, and so that can be an issue. So we have all these different ways that a person can get sick. These red arrows represent pathways to infect a person. And notice that people can, of course, infect each other, so let's not ignore that. A real concern right now is with coronavirus, how do women impact their children? Are children at risk if their mother's infected? This is still something that we're not quite sure about. So if we look at 2007, I know this is a little dated, but it's not so far dated that it's not relevant. Per year, we're still looking at about over 3 million with pneumonia and flu-related deaths. So quite a lot. And, HIV claims a lot of lives as well, and you can see how this works now. With the current pandemic we're dealing with, just within the U.S., the projections currently, and this is likely to change, are between 100,000 and 200,000 people could pass away from this. That just gives you a little bit of perspective on the current pandemic. The reason why certain bacteria, for example, become immune to antibiotics is that they reproduce a lot, genetic mutation is random, and you couple those two things together and you have a situation where if this random mutation happens in a way that prevents an antibiotic from working, you get something that can now thrive in that environment where there's antibiotic around. And because none of the other bacteria have that mutation, it's going to thrive well and reproduce even more, reproduce a lot of offspring because they won't have the competition of the other bacteria that are now not able to reproduce or they're dying. as we overuse antibiotics or pesticides, we're making this more likely. So MRSA is an example of such a bacterium. It's a Staphylococcus aureus, and it's resistant to most antibiotics. So it's the MRSA stands for methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, but as it becomes resistant to more and more antibiotics, it becomes an increasing threat to us, to hospitals where it tends to circulate sometimes. It can be a real issue. TB, we can't ignore it. It's been around for a long time, tuberculosis, and it's not going anywhere. You can see some of the issues here. This is what tuberculosis looks like in lungs where it's not been treated. It can destroy the lung tissue. I'm going to skip that part. Okay. The flu is the number one killer in terms of pathogens that are biological. In the world, HIV and Hep B are also there. Emergent diseases, things like coronavirus would be one of those. West Nile virus is also around, but it's not the front page news as coronavirus is right now for sure. But West Nile virus goes between horses and people, it seems, and it's spread. It's quite widespread at this point, but it's not as infectious as some of the other pathogens. So I mentioned horses and people, sharing West Nile. This field that studies this kind of thing is called ecological medicine, and maybe that's something you want to do with your life, is go into ecological medicine. Look at epidemiology, looking at risks associated with lifestyles that are more ecological in nature. So, the ways we can reduce chances of infection, these are things you've heard before. So, yeah, okay, not a lot there. I'm not going to talk a lot about that stuff. Let's see. Life expectancy from HIV has dropped dramatically, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where it is very widespread in some places. It is the number one killer of women globally in the prime years of life, 15 to 49. So while flu does kill a lot for women in that 15 to 49 category, flu is it. And so it alters the age structure of a population. We can look at that here in a second. Malaria is another one. It's got a really interesting life cycle. I encourage you to look it up. It's really strange. And it's found primarily in tropical and subtropical regions. Now, an interesting question is, what happens with climate change? Do we expect malaria to show up further north and south of the equator as its vector, the mosquito that can transport it, as its habitat expands? And the thought is yes, it's likely to be found further north and south of the equator. Let's see what else. Not a lot to say here. I will say that AIDS patients are particularly vulnerable to malaria. They are already in a weakened state, and so the plasmodium that causes it can do more damage. So here's a general distribution of malaria worldwide, and it would not be surprising to see some of these maps creep further north or south as climate change continues. One thing that people do sometimes is they'll sleep with like a net over their beds so that the mosquitoes can't get at them while they're sleeping. So things that we can do, vaccines, of course, if we vaccinate people, that is going to help. It helps all of us if we get vaccinated because it doesn't give the pathogen a foothold in an area if everyone there is vaccinated. Oral rehydration therapy is very useful. A lot of these pathogens cause diarrheal diseases, and so that can be a killer for sure, the dehydration that results from the sicknesses. So oral rehydration can help. Money is an issue, though, as it always is. So you can look at some of these solutions. This is posted on the website. Different types of things that we can do or you can do. Maybe you're interested in studying this with your life, making that difference. And that's where we're going to stop before moving on to the next section.